Here in Chapter 2.3, we're going to be taking a look at how America produces its goods and services, and then what role does the government play in the economy. So, how a country produces depends on what resource inputs are available. So what does that mean? Well, I think it should be pretty obvious that every country will choose different things to produce depending on what kind of resources they have. If you have well, for instance, is it surprising to Saudi Arabia, since they sit on such a huge amount of oil, that their economy specializes in oil production, okay? Or that Ukraine, quite famous, I don't know how many of you all have been paying attention to all the news about Ukraine and about the war, but Ukraine has a huge fertile plain, very similar to Kansas and Nebraska in the United States, and that fertile plain grows much of the world's wheat and corn is grown in the Ukraine. Quite surprisingly large amount, but they've got the land for it, so that's why they specialize in that instead of specializing in oil where they don't have much oil. Well, those are some pretty obvious ones based on nature, right? Natural resources like land and rainfall are usually pretty obvious why certain things grow there. Oh, and also, is it surprising to you that Pacific Islands grow a whole lot more coconuts than do Norway? I mean, of course, in Norway, you can't grow coconuts unless you put them in a glassed-in greenhouse. So obviously, it wouldn't make any sense for Norway to grow coconuts. But you have the Pacific Islands, they have the perfect amount of rainfall, lots of sun, nice warm weather, and the coconuts just grow naturally. So those are easy reasons to explain why Pacific Island grows coconuts, but Finland does not. Saudi Arabia produces oil, but Ukraine does not. Those are relatively easy things to understand. Now, others are a little more difficult because by looking at human beings, just looking at their physical outward appearance, you can't tell what people are productive at. But it turns out that people are just as different as geography is. Some people have a tremendous amount of human capital, the word we see here in blue, I'm going to highlight with my little red dot. Human capital, which we defined earlier as the knowledge and skills possessed by the workforce, differs dramatically across countries. So in a rich country like the United States, or Japan, or Canada, or Germany, we tend to see production of goods and services that require tremendous amounts of highly skilled workers, such as pharmaceutical production, pharmaceutical research, computer production, automobile production, things that are relatively difficult to do, requires lots of skilled workers. And so rich countries have lots of skilled workers, so they produce a lot of those items. Also, physical capital. Physical capital, as we talked about earlier, capital are the facilities, tools, equipment, and infrastructure available to the workforce in order to produce goods and services. So, physical capital has to be paid for. You need to have a wealthy country in order to have lots of physical capital. To have a construction site where most of the work is done with machines, so there's cranes to lift all the stuff to the second, third, and fourth floor, as opposed to having men put it on their backs and carry it upstairs, we realize that rich countries can get more work done with a given size workforce on a construction site because they have the machinery compared to a much poorer country where there won't be very much machinery. So all of these things contribute to why different countries produce both different things and different amounts of those things. So let's talk about the United States again on this particular issue. The capital stock. The capital stock is just another name for how much capital do you have. What's the total dollar amount of capital is your capital stock. The US has a very large capital stock. We are incredibly blessed with 18-wheeler trucks and bulldozers and computer systems and all kinds of machinery, office buildings, and all those kinds of things that make people productive. And we also invest very heavily in human capital. As you can see right here at Mercer, and of course all the other universities in the United States, the U.S. is investing a great deal of money in its people. Not the government is investing, but Americans are investing, usually with their own money at the college level, in their human capital, which makes workers very highly skilled. And once we've accumulated a massive amount of physical capital and we have a large number of highly educated workers, we tend to have what's called capital-intensive production processes, as we see here. Capital-intensive, from its very name, suggests that whatever production process you're using, you're going to use a lot of machinery or capital in that production process rather than doing it by hand. So in the United States, there's very, very little hand labor. Most things are done by machines, where workers tend machines or work with machines. They don't do all the work physically by hand. Even in something like construction, where you still see a lot of workers doing things by hand, they still do with a lot of machinery, at least in a wealthy country like the United States. So even individual carpenters have electric powered saws, they have pneumatic powered nail guns. You know, all this is equipment, right? And all that equipment speeds up the production process because workers are able to accomplish a lot more with a nail gun than if they have to hammer the nail in by hand for each and every nail. So you can see that this would make workers dramatically more productive. And therefore, households in the US are able to consume so much. In other words, the reason why the average American is so wealthy by world standards is because American workers produce so much. It turns out, and this is something very important to recognize, income comes from production. We oftentimes lose sight of that because if you're one small worker in a large organization and you don't deal directly with the customer, you're like inside the bureaucracy of your company, sometimes it's hard to see that what you're doing, rather what income you get, comes from producing something for a consumer. But it turns out that's in fact where all of our income comes from. That's not just true for Americans, it's true for everyone. Every country's income comes from whatever it is its workers produce. So, richer countries on average, not just the United States, richer countries tend to be capital intensive because they have lots of money to invest in capital, while poorer countries tend to be labor intensive. Labor intensive, by very definition, you can figure out what it means. It means whatever production process you're going to do, let's say construction, you're going to put wood on a roof in order to build the roof. In a poor country, you'll do it all by hand. You'll carry the lumber up to the roof on ladders. You will lay the boards down. You will hammer them in individually by hand because you have lots of people, because people are cheap. Labor is cheap in capital unintensive countries. Whereas in capital intensive countries, workers become relatively scarce compared to the amount of machines you have. So firms have to pay a lot of money for workers, and therefore workers are scarce. And therefore, if you are a contractor, you're going to make sure that you have some kind of mechanical lift to lift the 2x4s or the plywood to the roof very, very quickly. You're going to have men up there working with nail guns, and they'll go tat, 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 with the nails, and they'll get that whole roof done in a day, as opposed to doing it by hand, where it might take 2 or 3 days with an even larger crew. So, capital-intensive firms and societies that are capital-intensive use lots of capital, and they use relatively few workers because workers are expensive and scarce. Whereas in labor-intensive societies, they tend to be poor because in poor societies, since there's so little equipment, there's lots of workers per piece of machinery, and therefore workers are cheap, and therefore firms tend to specialize in using lots of workers instead of using more expensive machinery. Now, there's a couple of other reasons why the U.S. continues to have such a high level of productivity. And let's go back and take a look at productivity just for a second, make sure that we understand what this word means. Sometimes people think of productivity as I'm working harder. That's not necessarily true. It is true that if you work harder, you will be more productive than if you goof off, but that's not where the main form of productivity comes from. Let me give you an example. Picture in your mind a farmer in a capital-intensive country like the U.S. He has 500 acres, and he has a $100,000 John Deere tractor that he sits on, and he plows his land. Now, let's go to a farm in a much, much poorer country. In that poor country, the farmer cannot afford a $100,000 tractor, so he uses a buffalo or a horse in order to pull a plow, okay? And then the farmer has to push the plow. That farmer, instead of handling 500 acres, may only be able to handle 20, 30, or 40 acres, because that's all he can do with an animal plow. So the worker in the United States is dramatically more productive because he plows 500 acres, whereas the worker in the poor country only plows 20 acres. Is that because the American worker is working harder? Well, that's ridiculous, right? Sitting on a John Deere tractor, especially, I've seen some really fancy ones where they actually have air-conditioned cabs on those things nowadays. So the farmer is sitting in an air conditioning, just like in your car, is sitting in air conditioning while he's plowing, whereas the farmer who's behind his horse pushing a plow is working dramatically, physically harder, but he's not as productive because he doesn't produce as many acres of plowed land as the farmer in the United States, who's not working anywhere near as hard. So the difference there is our productivity comes from the machinery that American farmers are using. American farmers are among the most productive farmers in the world. And that's not because they work harder than other farmers, it's because they have tons of capital equipment in order to make themselves more productive. Now, I just gave a farming example because it's really easy to see the difference between a mechanized farmer and a farmer using a horse or a cow to plow with. But of course, that would also be true for any kind of production. Factories in the United States tend to be significantly more capital intensive than factories in other countries, especially poorer countries that don't have as much money to invest in the fancy equipment. So let's take a look at this issue. What's contributing to high productivity in the U.S.? Issue number one, and this is not necessarily in order of importance, this is just an important issue, something called factor mobility. Factor, of course, comes from factor of production, and factor of production was the name we used to describe the workers, the machinery, the capital goods, the natural resources called land, entrepreneurship. Those were the factors of production. And factor mobility means, and let's read it together, we'll just read the slide, means rapid reallocation of resources from declining industries to expanding industries in response to changing demand and technology. Factor mobility is very difficult for societies to do. Let me give you an example of factor mobility. When I was you all's age, I'm assuming you all are mostly in your 20s, maybe in your 30s, but mostly in your 20s. When I was you all's age, I didn't even own a computer. All the papers I typed when I was in school were done on a manual typewriter. Now, as you all know, the invention of the word processing computer, Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computer, was instrumental in that. He's not the only one, of course. Lots of other people contributed. We have Bill Gates from Microsoft and a whole bunch of other people, I'll name them all, were all contributing to inventing this new technological revolution that lets the average individual person own and operate a computer. So we had to shut down the typewriter industry and move all those workers out of typewriter construction and move them over to some other industry where their skills could be used more effectively. In the United States, because we have a very strong laissez-faire capitalist attitude, we permitted Smith Corona typewriter, Olivetti, there's a bunch of other companies that were in the typewriter business. They all went bankrupt and laid off their workers. In many other countries in the world, the legal system does not permit firms to lay off workers very easily, at least not without paying huge payments or having government permission as to whether they're allowed to do this or not. So firms oftentimes get locked into older technology or obsolete technology, not because the business people are stupid and don't know they need to change, it's because government prevents them from changing. Now, why would a government do this? Well, clearly the workers at Smith Corona Typewriter Company that went bankrupt are not happy with the computer revolution, or at least they weren't back then. I mean, this all happened back in the 1980s and early part of the 1990s. They lost their jobs. They had to get retrained. They may have even had to sell their house and move to another city in order to find a job doing something else. Because if they were working in a city that was based on typewriter production, a large number of the factories shut down in that city, so they have to move to another city. Every one of those things is very difficult. Nobody likes getting laid off. No one likes having to relocate and get new skills and new training and starting all over again. But for society as a whole, was it valuable? There's no doubt. I think everyone recognizes the U.S. is dramatically more productive because the average person has both computer skills, which they've gotten from the fact that they actually own their own computer and are able to play with a computer all the time. They have their own smartphone. They have electronic games. All of these things teach the average person from the time that they were a child how to manipulate electronic devices. So once they get to worker age, firms can hire them and train them relatively easily to, in fact, integrate into the modern world using high tech, right? And we all are doing this right now. We are saving the money and effort of you driving to class, me driving to class. We're all able to do this through this really cool computer system. Now, I'm at my age struggling with trying to keep up with how do I make this computer stuff work. And you'll probably hear me make fun of myself on this on a regular basis, but I suspect most of you all recognize this. Older generation people on average, not everyone, some older people are very good with technology, but on average older people haven't kept up as much as young people. So this is part of what factor mobility is all about. Does your society permit business firms to essentially shut down and leave declining industries in order to move to newer, more productive industries? The U.S. does permit it, and that's what keeps the U.S. on the cutting edge constantly of reinventing itself, shutting down old industries, inventing new industries, and moving forward. Number 2, technological advancement. And the two go hand in hand. Technological advancement is what causes the need for factor mobility. Technological advancement refers to finding new and better ways to produce products. So when technology advances, an economy can produce more output with the existing resources, in particular the existing workers. The same number of workers can produce more if they're working with technology. Let's use a simple technology. I've already mentioned it once before. We have carpenters who are installing roofs on houses. They're putting the wood down on the roof by hammering in individual nails by hand. That takes a long time, okay? A technological advance, and of course this all took place way back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Somebody invented the nail gun, which operates with an air compressor. So the exact same carpenter who used to take 2 or 3 days to hand nail all the nails on a roof can now in one morning between 8 o'clock and before lunchtime can nail down the entire roof because he's using an air-powered nail gun now rather than do it by hand. That would be an example of a technological advance. Now, most of us looking backwards say, oh, that's no big deal. That's a relatively small technological advance. And it was. But when you do technological advance after technological advance, even if each individual one of them is relatively minor, if you keep doing it over and over and over again, you end up having a society that grows rapidly. And if the society is growing rapidly, more rapidly, of course, than the population's growing, then what happens is you have larger GDP per capita, which raises the living standards of the people. So technological advancement is what shifts out the production possibilities curve. As we discussed in the previous chapter, the production possibilities curve shifts outward. So the same number of resources of workers can now produce more of both roofs for houses and more, docks to put your boat at, right? We can now have both of those at the same time, even though we have the same number of carpenters, because with nail guns, they're able now to do enough work to get both of those things done, whereas back in the 1940s or 50s, they could only do one or the other, and therefore people who owned a house could not simultaneously have a dock for their boat, or whatever it is that we want carpenters to do. So I just want you all to recognize, using my simple examples, how if you do this across the board for an entire economy, you end up having a highly productive economy. Now, many societies, again, do not permit technological advancement, or they slow it down, or they come up with all kinds of rules that prevent technological advancements from happening. Let me give you an example. What if you have a highly unionized workforce among the carpenters, and the construction company sees that someone's invented the new air compressor and nail gun and says, I'd like to now start using nail guns on my construction site. By the way, I'll end up laying off half my carpenters because I'll only need the remaining half can do all the work of the previous carpenters. What do you think the union says? Oh, this would be wonderful? Or do you think the union says, no, we're going to fight this. We're not going to permit you to use a nail gun. Unfortunately, that's what happens in large numbers of countries, either through government activity, union activity, or some other social mechanism. the ability to introduce new technology, because new technology always displaces somebody. There's no such thing as a perfect new technology that only hires new workers. Every new technology causes a reduction in employment in some other field. The invention of the computer knocked out the typewriter industry. The invention of the digital phone, of the digital camera on your phone, knocked out Kodak camera, which no longer does the film as much. I mean, they still do some, but it's way smaller. And Kodak has shrunk dramatically and laid off thousands of workers because people don't buy the chemical film anymore. They use the digital camera. So all of those are examples where when we have the new technology, it has a major increase in output, but it also causes a dislocation of existing workers in the existing technologies. So now over time, of course, those workers get retrained to do new technology somewhere else, but during that time period, they're very resistant. In capitalist societies, they cannot resist because no individual person owns the entire construction industry. No individual government official has the right to say you can't use nail guns. And the business firm certainly wants to use the nail gun because it will save so much money, and therefore their profits will rise. So in capitalist countries, new technology tends to get introduced relatively rapidly compared to non-capitalist countries. Outsourcing and trade. Here's another major advantage that the United States has. We tend to have, we meaning we the United States, tends to have a relatively low restriction on trade. Not none. The US still has trade restrictions, but compared to other societies, the amount of trade restrictions are few. Why is this important? Well, it turns out that different countries have more productivity at producing some items than other items. We've already explained why that's true, either for reasons of differences in natural geography, differences in quality of workforces, differences in availability of resources. All kinds of things make for some societies to be more productive at certain things than other societies. So when the US finds something that foreigners do better or cheaper than the US can do it itself, because we are a mostly laissez-faire capitalist society, business firms simply go overseas to get that item and then bring it into the United States. So what does that do? It lowers the cost of buying goods and services in the United States relative to people's incomes. So people have a higher standard of living. So trade has a major advantage for the US. Outsourcing is something that's actually, trade is a form of outsourcing. It's outsourcing to a foreign country. But let's think about outsourcing, which really gets condemned a lot, especially like in media, newspapers, TV. When they talk about these things, they almost always make it negative. But outsourcing, in fact, increases productivity quite dramatically. Whenever you can find someone else to do something for you that can be done cheaper than you can do it yourself, you should outsource it. I'll give you, again, a personal example just to illustrate this, because it's so easy to leave this at a philosophical level that you never truly grasp it. Now, my wife is a nurse practitioner. Now, she wasn't always a nurse practitioner. We had children, and she stayed home for many years while she was raising children. Then when the children got to a certain age, went back to school, got her nursing degree, continued on, and became a nurse practitioner. Now, when she was in nursing school, she was still trying to maintain the same work at home, doing house chores that she did when she wasn't working. And she was doing things like ironing my shirts, like the shirt I'm wearing right now. She would iron herself in order to save the $2 it cost to send it to the dry cleaner. So she thought she was saving money. And I saw her one time, here we are, 10 o'clock at night. She has a book, her nursing book, propped up on her ironing board, trying to study while she's ironing. And I asked her, says, how much money are you going to make as a nurse? And she, of course, tells me what the pay is. I says, how much would it cost us to get that shirt that you're ironing done by the cleaner? And she tells me what the dollar amount is, which is significantly lower than the amount she would earn as a nurse. And I asked her, are you actually saving money? If you save the $2 by ironing my shirt, but you do badly on this exam because you aren't able to concentrate and you lose out on that good nursing job, will you have saved money or will we have lost money as a family? and then she all of a sudden realizes, oh yeah, we should study more economics. It actually costs my wife more money to iron her own shirt than it would be to send it to the dry cleaner. So we now outsource our ironing to the dry cleaner. Not because we're rich, but because the cost of dry cleaning is lower than the income that we could earn with that time. So everything has an opportunity cost. Even ironing your own shirt is not free. It costs you time. That time could have been used more productively elsewhere, right? So my point from that little personal example is to illustrate, now we do this on a much larger scale, when a factory looks at a particular job and says, you know, that particular thing could be done cheaper elsewhere, I'm going to outsource this production to Mexico, for instance. Now the US firm can concentrate on, let's do the things that our workers are really good at. Since we have so much capital and we have such highly educated workers, why don't we do the research in the United States, and we'll do the engineering and all the design work in the US, and we'll manufacture the item in Mexico or China or some other country where labor is relatively cheap. And that's exactly what outsourcing is all about. It's no different than my wife sending the shirts out to the dry cleaner to save time so she can spend time on something far more valuable, getting a nursing degree. And you all will be, of course, doing the same thing. You will be outsourcing all kinds of things. I would not be surprised, especially if any of you all, if you follow the normal pattern and you have a highly educated husband and a highly educated wife, most likely she'll be a professional person and will be working outside the home. You will be outsourcing many of your meals to restaurants. When you go to a restaurant, you are outsourcing. Many of you all will end up getting a maid service. Instead of, vacuuming your own rugs, you'll pay someone else to do it because they will do it cheaper than if you gave up time at work to do it yourself. You will be outsourcing your dry cleaning. You'll be outsourcing all kinds of things because it's cheaper to pay someone else to do it than it is for you to do it yourself when your time is valuable, okay? So, again, I'll stop flogging this. I think we all can recognize why the US does this, and it's because capitalism permits firms to make these decisions. Because unfortunately, you remember, in the short run, the American worker is getting laid off to relocate the production to the lower cost country. So in the short run, the worker being laid off is clearly not happy about that. But the productivity of the overall economy rises dramatically. That worker ends up, after time and getting retraining, rehired at a better job elsewhere in the economy because he's now doing more productive work than he was doing before, and total income per capita, GDP per capita rises.